What happens when you take somebody who spent years inside the Central Intelligence Agency analyzing how power actually works and put put them in one of the largest public transit systems in the world during a global pandemic and then hand them a Substack? You get today's guest. Robert Choi is a former CIA political analyst who is recognized by both the agency and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence for his work. He went on to serve as a deputy chief of human resources at the New York Metropolitan Authority, where he helped steer organizations of tens of thousands of employees through the chaos of COVID-19. He holds a degree in political science from the Columbia University and a master's in government from Johns Hopkins. He's the author of The Art of Public Service, published by Simon and I can't even say that word. And he is the founder of the Choi Report, a Substack publication that has quickly become the sharpest voices in political commentary today. But what makes Robert different is he's not just a pundit recycling talking points. He's somebody who has been in the inside of the machine, the intelligence community, the bureaucracy, the political rooms, and walked away asking two questions that nobody in power wants to answer. Is that really true? And compared to what? He calls his framework institutional realism, and he uses it to tear apart everything from the myth of economic victims to the media's obsession with narratives over the data to the future of US-China relations. He's sharp, he's direct, and he doesn't come to flatter either side. Robert, thank you for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here and nice to meet you.
I appreciate you coming on. My audience is very well versed across the world, and we have a lot of questions when it comes to the US China relations. But before we get into that, I ask all of my guests one question. What is a truth in your industry that people do not want to admit?
That's a great question. I think first and foremost that government cannot solve all of the problems that people believe that it can. As a matter of fact, most of the time, government is causing the problems that people are seeing. And there are just countless examples of that throughout history. And in this day and age, with digitization and AI, and social media, people's attention span is very short. So there is less of a perspective of historicity. But if you look at history, you can see, what has happened when government intervenes.
Very fair. And you're speaking to the choir here. I was a former government employee myself, saw how the government doesn't work and decided to leave because it's not the place for change. Where do you think the narrative of the government has your best interest in mind came from?
Well, it's a sociological question. It's a complex question, but you know, in modern political history, it's through political rhetoric, and it's through the outcome of a lack of accountability across government. And what I mean by that is you have policymakers who make policy, and these policies often involve hundreds of billions of dollars and they impact millions of people. And there are agencies, bureaucracies, organizations employing thousands of people to carry out the administrative and bureaucratic duties of this policy. But the problem is nobody is accountable for the outcomes of the policy when it's put in place. And as Milton Friedman has said, there is nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. And if you look at public administration and how that works, it begins to become self-aware, almost self-aware and self-sustaining. So the mission or the policy intent behind the bureaucracy often is deprioritized from the mission of the policy or the intent of the policy. It really becomes about survival and people keeping their jobs and remaining relevant versus changing the lives of people for the better at the end of the day. And the reason why that is that the government is very bad at doing that. So it needs to constantly justify its existence often through false measures and metrics that don't mean anything. and the whole tyranny of process that I've written about is true. So, I think that's ever more salient today than before. And I think
It,
that's really where, the issue lies. It's the lack of accountability. And, because of the nature of politics in the United States and the election cycles married with the media and journalism cycles, you know, people don't pay attention to sometimes the outcomes of policies, which sometimes take, longer than the election or media cycles. So I think that, as citizens, whether in Canada or the United States, and it's important for us to look at empirical evidence and to ask those two questions that I encourage everybody to ask, which is, what's really going on here? Is what's being said to me by politicians true? And when they do say it, what is that compared to? When they say we're doing great, well, it's doing great compared to what? And you talk about poverty in this country, in the United States, it's people talking about inequality and poverty, and it's worse it's ever been, and which is obviously not true. And it's compared to what? So I think, those are two important questions to ask. And I think that people have to pay attention to rhetoric.
I very much appreciate that you're one out there for asking. And I actually had a follow up question to it's kind of a tangent question, but I've noticed that a lot of CIA personnel have been coming out into social media and becoming prominent in like social circles. Is that kind of like a response to what's happening nowadays? Or is it some sort of like I'm just trying to like understand why we're getting a lot more CIA perspective out of now than we used to.
Well, I think it has in part to do with the availability of platforms to be able to do more in terms of share thoughts and commentary. I also think that, there's just a lot more information out there, so we know more in general. So I think there's more opportunity, more platforms to get the message out there. And I think there's, a growing interest in where this country is heading. And I think that we're reaching a tipping point in a lot of areas of public administration and bureaucracy and government affairs that are no longer viable. And one of the greatest things that the Trump administration has done is to shake the status quo. Whether you agree with his policies, his administration, whether you love him or hate him, that is I think, the biggest contribution, positive contribution that he has made in United States politics in modern political history, because we cannot keep going the way that we have been going in terms of spending what we're spending, and the lack of accountability that exists for all policies, going back to the 90s, the questions about the economy and the Federal Reserve. Does that need to, does the Federal Reserve need to exist here in this country? And, obviously, first and foremost is national security. What does it mean to protect one's own sovereignty? And what does national security mean in an increasingly smaller, globalized world? And we've been talking about that. Not that issue is not new. We've been talking about that for 30 years, but there's now more of an awareness that we haven't made any progress on answering any of these questions. And you see the same characters in government coming in and coming out and saying the same things, and there's no change, and there's not even progress. As a matter of fact, I'm conducting a study on improper payments of the United States federal government. And for the last 30 years, the GAO and other institutions have been issuing pretty much the same report, saying there's been trillions of dollars in improper payments over the last 30 years. And there have been at least 5 sweeping legislative acts to correct that, and nothing has changed in 30 years. So, and the improper, not only has nothing changed, but it's gotten worse, and nobody's accountable. And so, I think that's why more people are speaking out from all parts of the government. And I think that, that's a good thing to have more voices. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but, I think an empirical study would show that the media is left leaning. A lot of the media is left leaning. There are counterbalancing programs out there, but I think overall it's empirically and objectively true that the media is left leaning. So we do need more voices out there. If you think about DEI, this DEI as an initiative and a concept in culture has existed for at least 20 years, and for at least 15 of those years we have known that it doesn't work. Not only does it work, it's counterproductive in many areas, but we have kept doing it, we have kept funding it, and we have kept talking about it as if it's a positive, it contributes something to the actual problems of discrimination and inequality, to the extent that that exists, and depending on how you define it. But the only way you get criticized for DEI in the last few years, in the last decade, is if you question it. If you say, is this actually working, or what does this actually mean? Does this actually improve the lives for minorities or other people who are so-called underserved? If you ask those questions, you're automatically branded a racist or a bigot or stupid or narrow-minded. And we can't really have a national conversation, or much less a societal or civilizational conversation that's productive, unless you can hear all of the voices. So
I appreciate the sentiment on that. I get that a lot. I actually just wrote a report on manufacturing consent and how it relates to our media's bias towards our political candidates. And I got told, you can't use this post because it's from this guy who was racist 100 years ago. And you can't use Wikipedia because it's all controlled by this guy. And I'm like, if I can't use any information to tell you anything, how am I supposed to get my message across? Like, people need to stop thinking that because somebody has done something bad, it means their expertise and their relevance don't matter. Like that's not something that can happen.
and
These
it's even
people have
more
been in those figures.
and it's even more blatant than that, because I have been in academic circles and think tank circles, and in every freshman political science class and every international relations class in graduate schools, you'll see the same character of theorists. But what you won't see, for example, is James Q. Wilson, who wrote one of the most significant seminal works on the problem of bureaucracy. You won't see these kind of authors. Charles Murray is another example of how the welfare state in this country since the 1950s has completely contributed to the decay of society, and that these programs have had unintended consequences for the people that these programs were designed to help, that are generationally, deleterious and destructive for these groups over the course of several decades. And these are not included because there are elitist, intellectual, left leaning gatekeepers at these universities. And that goes all the way out to who's getting the funding for research, who's paying for that research, who's endowing these chairs, who's on these admissions committees, who's on the boards. And it's like a liberal, progressive, party for these intellectuals, not to mention the anti Zionist sentiment that is at a lot of these universities, including my own Columbia University, who, is I just cannot believe what they allow and what they call free speech on that campus, unfortunately.
It's actually like quite a bit harsher over here. Like we've had Jordan Peterson literally lose his credentials at his university because of speaking out against the gender inequality thing. And we've just gone full barrel since then. Our government has clamped down. We have now censorship laws. Our media doesn't get out there. The only time it does is when we're getting mocked, like equity cards with our NDP candidates. But the reason I like that you're going into this is because it really does showcase how Canada is doing the exact same thing. And I like that kind of narrative. And I do want to touch back on the point that if you don't like Donald Trump, it doesn't matter, because as far as everybody's concerned, or as far as I'm concerned, he's touched everything, which means every single institution in the United States now needs to change, because you don't know what has happened to them. And I think that's the biggest push that we need globally, is just our institutions to like wake up and start changing to service the people that they were supposed to service instead of themselves, which they're doing now.
That's, I couldn't agree more. And if you want to think about what the president's job is constitutionally here in this country, he is doing exactly what a president should do, which is focus on national security, which is the president's most important job and over which he has the most control and most constitutional authority, and use that to improve, the way that we interact with the rest of the world. Um, and when we talked before the show, and we talked a little bit about national security and people in Canada wondering what's happening with the Trump administration and what it's doing on foreign policy. I can say that where you have to look first is when it comes to thinking about what Donald Trump is doing strategically and administratively. It's really got to look at tariffs. And there's now a record of relationship between Canada and the United States vis-a-vis the Trump administration's policies on tariffs. And the tariffs and rhetorical pressure on Canada has been intense, that's no doubt. And from inside of Canada, it's understandable that it reads as a serious diplomatic rupture to people who, buy into that narrative of the status quo. But if you place it next to what's happening simultaneously with US foreign policy and European NATO members, and you mentioned China, as well as with Taiwan, you see a very strategic, recognizable pattern. And that is the Trump administration is focusing on a fairly small toolkit that's constitutionally sanctioned. And that toolkit is tariffs, public pressure, or otherwise known here in the United States as the bully pulpit, as well as conditional commitments. And these are among the strongest tools that any president has. And the criticism of Donald Trump and his administration is often that he's using the tools that the president has to make change. And people don't like that. People don't like when their status quo is changed and when all that research and vendor money is up for grabs or questioned. So, the administration, it tends to deploy these tools in similar ways, across the international community, regardless who's on the receiving end.
Mm.
And for example, Trump told the European NATO members that their contribution has to be larger and that their 2% of GDP defense contributions were inadequate, and they are. The U.S. taxpayer has been funding, NATO defense for many years. Not that that's a bad thing, but it's a legitimate question to ask to say, are NATO allies contributing enough? And Europe responded with a 5% commitment by 2035. So if it was completely invalid and unreasonable, I don't think we would have seen them agreeing to that, at least in principle, because they know
Well,
that the 2% of GDP is a ridiculous contribution for national security when that's the first thing government needs to be doing, any government. And he
it's
also
it's
told Taiwan the same thing.
it's funny. I just want to point out that you mentioned that because our government just hit the 2%, but if you look at the accounting, it doesn't even match up. So it's like one of those things of the narrative or the media narrative playing again. Like we said we did it, but we didn't. We just did some fancy accounting to showcase that we did. These are actual problems that are going to cause issues if they're ever looked into.
Yeah, I totally agree, particularly in the Canadian case. I mean, this pressure and the use of this strategic toolkit, what I call the strategic toolkit of the Trump administration, is very noticeable in Canada. I mean, your political system absorbed and responded to these pressures. Prime Minister Carney was elected on an explicit sovereignty platform, just as, Trump was elected on that platform. And it created a domestic in my view, it created a domestic political mandate for exactly the kind of independent capacity building that the doctrine is designed to encourage, our doctrine. So, to your point, roughly within a year, Canada hit the 2% NATO target, and it signed on to an additional 5% commitment. And it also joined the EU's Safe Defense Initiative, and it also opened up a substantive review of the F-35 procurement. So these are things that would not have happened without asking questions of the status quo. And I think taken together, the trade diversification with China, the rethinking of the European defense partnership, and even the Arctic spending program, which is another issue. I think it represents that Canada is materially more self-reliant in 2026 than it was in 2024, and I think everybody can say that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with a lot of the things that are happening. I just disagree with the narrative and the messaging that's coming along with it, because it all seems fine and dandy until you actually look under the hood. This does get into what's going on in the world. Why now are we suddenly doing all of this? Why now is the US completely changing how they've run things?
Well, I think we're returning back to something people learn when they study political science, and it's it's the state of nature and realism, and classical realism. We're returning to those theories now. Whether or not the Trump administration is doing that deliberately, I don't know, but I mean, somebody knows that it's happening. And the doctrine in one breath is this: if you look past the political rhetoric and the same tired voices in the media and journalism circuits and the pundit circles, and you look at the actual decisions that have been made in 2025, what you see is a very reasonable and disciplined strategic framework that's been carried out internationally. The strikes on Iran's nuclear program were narrow, and they were tightly defined. The pressure, as we were just saying, on NATO produced, 5% of GDP commitment by 2035. The pressure on Taiwan has produced a defense budget pushing past 3.3%, which is unprecedented. And these are coherent, not only strategic moves, but they're actually outcomes. They are results. And even when the surrounding language, which is what a lot of people don't like about Donald Trump himself, is inflammatory, the results speak for themselves. And the underlying principle, which is President Trump's mandate from the American people, the underlying principle is that American security guarantees are now treated as conditional rather than entitled or automatic. And I think that strategically for us, that is a fair and reasonable position to take. I mean, allies are expected to contribute meaningfully to their own defense, as they should want to, and the relationship is reassessed when they don't. And this is something which boggles the mind, that has not been happening for decades. It's a very reasonable position to take, and that marks the end. The Trump administration has marked, with this strategic positioning, has marked the end of the post 1949 arrangement, in which the United States effectively underwrote the security of the Western world without asking for much in return. And that's not even including foreign aid packages. So, which is a whole nother disaster. And these issues are not going to go away when Trump leaves office. The next Republican or Democrat administration will have to, run on its own doctrine. And we'll see. We can directly compare and empirically compare the results of the next administration to this one in terms of making progress, challenging the status quo. And, hopefully, as Democrats in this country like to do, hopefully there will be a lot of bluster about how Trump was awful, but they will quietly continue most of the policies because of their results. And that has been what Democratic administrations have done here in this country, since the 80s and 90s, or the 70s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s. which is whether you're talking about Congress or the presidency, they quietly continue successful policies, which are by and large led and shepherded by Republican administrations. And I'm talking about national security and the economy specifically. But overall, when you read this strategic toolkit and the use of it and the doctrine, the classical realist doctrine, which is what I think the Trump doctrine is, if you read it as a strategic framework, the pattern across Iran, Europe, Taiwan, Canada becomes remarkably consistent. And a lot of foreign observers read it primarily through the personality of the president, which turns out to be, sometimes inflammatory, sometimes even distasteful. But that's the least informative aspect about what's really happening on the ground and the results that it's producing.
I laugh at that narrative quite a bit because it's like we've known Trump for a long time. He's been on Twitter since Twitter existed. Like he's always done this stuff. Why did you think he was going to do any different as the president? I don't treat his tweets as religious text. I make sure I understand what he's doing and why he's doing it. Yeah, I don't like the man, but I do agree with a lot of what has happened because I think even in my generation, growing up over the past 30 years, we have realized that everything's a lie, everything's built on assumptions, and nobody's held accountable to anything. And that's all we want is people just held accountable to things and to make sure that when we say we're going to do something, we either actually do it or we investigate it to the point where we're like, okay, it's not a good idea. And stop trying to just make people out to be whatever the other side thinks they are.
I'm a big proponent in this government and elsewhere of designing termination clauses into programs and initiatives that the government starts. Because what you want in a high functioning government is programs that actually end because that means they were effective. So when the perfect example is, the UN development goals are on hunger and poverty and extreme poverty. Those programs have been happening for 30 years. And even Bono, one of its biggest champions of international aid and development, will say to you that none of these programs have worked.
Mm-hmm.
And they just keep going on and on and on. And had you really solved hunger and poverty, they wouldn't need to exist. So what does that mean? That means all of the research, all of the contractors, all of the vendors who are involved in the logistics, the transportation, the delivery, the administration of these programs no longer would have jobs. And so essentially what you create is a program initiative and uh, a cabal of organizations that don't want to actually solve the problem. And I think that's why we need to have termination clauses, whether we're funding the programs or initiatives, whether we're starting them, whether we're housing them, administering them. Those need to be built into the design, and there needs to be automatic triggers for termination based upon the effectiveness and the results of the program.
I completely agree. And I hope we get that in some time. The one last thing I just wanted to touch on, I hope UBI doesn't come in because that's going to be a never ending slog and we're just going to end up in the same situation. I know we're at time, so I just want to give you a last minute to shout who you are, and where people can find you.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and thank you for having me. Everyone, you can read more of my thoughts on the choireport.com. We post every week, and hopefully, soon we're going to be posting more as we grow. But we want to also make sure that we walk the walk and talk the talk, which is to produce high quality content that is empirically verifiable. So we're not going to sacrifice quality for quantity, but we're on Facebook, we're on Substack. And if you like what I have to say and you agree with at least some of what I'm saying, we would love you to follow our Facebook page, the Choi Report, and we would love you to subscribe to our Substack. It's free for now.
Thank
And
you very much.
we're also, one last thing, we're also the fastest growing Substack on the conservative libertarian topics right now. So we have on the Choi Report over 250 unique views per month, and that's in less than a year. Many of those views are organic. So join the movement in asking people for results.
Thank you very much for your time. And I'll make sure everything's in the comments down below. To everybody out there, if you need anything, please make sure to reach out. And thank you for listening and stay weird.